Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Anthony Burd, formerly of the Department for Communities and Local Government. So, would Mr. Burd come in, please? Good morning, Mr. Burd.
Good morning, sir.
All ready to carry on?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. Yes, Mr. Villiers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Good morning to you. Good morning to the members of the panel. And Mr. Burd, good morning to you.
And to you.
Now, on Thursday evening, when we finished the hearing, you may recall that you were helping us with the structure of the functional requirement and how that worked in tandem with ADB, both in the 1992 and the 2000 editions of that document. And you told us about the circumstances in which the word adequate or adequately came to be in the 2000 edition, whereas it had not been in the 1992 edition or version of the functional requirement B41. My question is, do you have any insight into why it was that the original version of the building regulations in 1985, as passed, contained the word adequate, and indeed the words of the functional requirement said the external walls of the building shall offer adequate resistance to the spread of fire over the walls? First, did you know that?
No, I did not, sir.
Right. My second question is, are you able to enlighten us as to any institutional knowledge within the department about the reasons why the word adequate was originally in the building regulations and then came out of the functional requirement in 1992?
I'm afraid I cannot.
You don't?
No,
right.
sir.
So from your perspective, is this right, that the word adequate was introduced, in fact reintroduced, in 2000 for the reasons you told us on Thursday?
Yes.
Right, thank you. Now, can we then go to where we were on Thursday evening, which was the literature review? BRE 401353, please. I'll just put the first page of that document up again for you so you can see it. In fact, that's the covering letter. But can we go to the first page, page 2 of the document? Maybe page 3 of the document, just to... see the document. Right, can we go to page 4, please? We can just see the title there and the date, 30th of March 2000. Now, can we go to page 27 in it, please? Now, there is the conclusion, and we looked at this on Thursday. But if we look at the second conclusion there, it says this: the 2000 revision of ADB goes some way to addressing the issues of fire performance of external cladding systems. The review of BR 135 will help to clarify any remaining issues as identified. Is it possible that that conclusion was in some way based on the misunderstanding rehearsed in the report that diagram 40 restricted the combustibility of the external walls of buildings over 18 metres, as we saw before?
I wouldn't have thought so, sir.
Why is that?
This was forming part of the initial work in the form of a literature review. They would have found feedback and understanding, therefore as it was only tantamount to a literature review, I don't think they would have wanted to say anything too much until they had completed the undertaking of the work. So the questions that you took me through on Thursday spoke about the word combustible in relation to diagram 40, and I wouldn't have thought something as in the way of that statement would have then fed and drawn them to this conclusion in number 2, as we see here.
What were the remaining issues which had not been addressed by the 2000 revision of approved document B in some way, but which the literature review concluded would be clarified by the review of BR 135?
From recollection, there was a need to look at how we would utilise a full-scale test, and therefore the pass criteria would be going into BR 135. There were considerations, I believe, you'll have to forgive me, sir, this is some 22 years ago. There would have been considerations about all of the relevant section of the building regulations, section 13. So it would have been considering diagram 40, external surfaces, but also the guidance then provided in the 2000 edition in relation to external wall construction. So it would be quite a wide consideration.
Yes. The word issues of fire performance, which will be addressed, and the review of BR 135 would help to clarify any remaining issues. By issues, what did that mean? Does that mean problems? Did it mean disputes? What did that mean?
I don't recall.
Right.
But it could relate to questions that had been raised. It would have been cognizant of the points raised by the Select Committee as well.
Right. So how would the review of BR 135 help to clarify any remaining issues, whatever they were?
My understanding would be that BR 135 was being revised, and it could offer additional guidance that could support the industry in its appreciation of external wall construction and cladding testing.
Would it? I mean, BR 135, as revised, provided a set of objective criteria which were pass-fail, against which the results of a BSA 414, then Part 1 test would be judged. Is that not?
But my understanding and recollection, and say, please forgive me, sir, is that it also provides broader guidance on the types of installation, types of thermal insulation, and points to note, such as cavity barriers.
Right, I see. Now, during the course of this project, was any consideration given to limiting all elements of the external wall construction to materials of limited combustibility or to non-combustible materials?
From recollection, I don't know. However, when you look, and you kindly allowed me to take you through section 13 of the extant ADB 2000 as amended on Thursday, statements in paragraph 13.7 already covered that to some degree. I think this was very much looking as to where are we now, comments coming forward from the Select Committee, and the undertaking of testing to see what sort of performance some of those products that were in the marketplace or coming onto the marketplace, how they would perform.
Was any consideration given at the time to requiring all elements of the external wall construction to be materials of limited combustibility?
That would typically be a matter, sorry sir, to answer your question, not that I recall, no I don't believe so.
Right. And why is that?
Because this is a piece of research work with a publication at the end to offer further guidance. If there were to be a consideration for something to be required, that would typically be for the purposes of consideration under any sort of review of the building regulations and the approved document B, ultimately.
Now, let's go to BRE 3041887. This is a project report prepared for you, dated the 24th of July 2000, and its title is Survey Summary and Options Report. Let's go to page 3, Executive Summary. You can see there that it outlines the results of the BRE cladding survey, and it provides various options for the large-scale experimental studies that had been proposed in the original bid documentation. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, if we go to page 6 of this document, you can see there's a heading, Survey Responses, and the report at the foot of the page, page 6, says survey responses, and in the first sentence and second sentences, it says 45 questionnaires were issued. Of these, 17 responses were received. Figure 1 summarises the categories and responses received. The number of responses received were less than expected. In fact, it's right, isn't it? There were only 13 responses received.
From recollection, yes.
Yes, and we have a spreadsheet which shows that. I can take you to it if you like, but take it from me that it does. Now, my question is this. With only about a third of organisations responding to the BRE survey, do you know how the BRE, and through them you, could have gained a proper and comprehensive understanding of the current industry practice in relation to the overcladding of existing building stock in the UK?
From recollection, it would be my understanding looking back that we would have utilised the industry advisory group. And as we discussed on Thursday, it was a large group. It certainly would have been quite accurate in terms of having regulators, building control bodies, and the relevant trade associations who represent those parts of the industry that make these products. So in addition to actually BRE going back out and trying to re-engage with those people they originally approached, and through a discussion I envisage with the IAG, it ultimately would have given us sufficient confidence to move forward.
Right. So who took the decision to proceed without issuing further surveys to other organisations?
I can't recall, but ultimately, as I say, there would have been a discussion around the IAG and a retry back out to the industry, and that final decision would have rested with the department at the end of the day, but under best advice. If I may, sir, just to add, you might have noticed over the course of the inquiry, this industry is not the best at responding at times to such surveys and similar, we've found. And so, sometimes even when we've reviewed approved documents, sometimes it's been, we haven't always got the responses we thought we were likely to achieve. This sort of thing wasn't necessarily uncommon.
Right. When this report came in, did you or anybody in the department suggest to the BRE that more data than 17, or in fact, as it turned out, 13 responses was needed, and more surveys should be sent out?
I can't recall, but I would envisage that this would have been reverted back to the industry advisory group for consideration.
Well, wasn't the industry advisory group there to assist the department rather than to advise the department on what was necessary by way of survey?
The industry advisory group, sir, was there to best advise the operation of this particular contract. So I envisage we would have, or BRE would have engaged with the IAG to get further understanding and appreciation to try and build.
Now, Dr. Colwell told. So sorry, I cut you off.
No, not at all, sir.
Dr. Colwell told us that the BRE referred this back to the department and asked what you wanted to do about it. That was transcript day 232, page 58, lines 9 to 20. Do you remember that?
I can't recall it.
Right.
No.
Do you say she's wrong, or you just can't recall?
I can't recall, but I couldn't see us not re-engaging with the IAG to further understand what we had and if they could offer any further advice.
Right.
The benefit of having the industry advisory group there, especially with the trade associations and local authorities, is that they could have potentially lent on people to further participate in that consultation.
Now, if we go to page 10 of this document, Mr. Burd, we can see that there's a heading, Survey Conclusions. It's there in the middle of your screen. And it concludes as follows. Based on this survey, it would appear that although the number of responses have been limited, they provide sufficient data to form a consistent view of the types of external cladding systems used in the public housing sector. On what basis was that conclusion reached?
Envisage after discussions with and consideration of the responses they had back on the survey and potentially having tested it also with the industry advisory group.
It doesn't say that. It says, based on this survey, that although the number of responses is limited, they provide sufficient data to form a consistent view. There's no reference there to adding to that data the views of the IAG. Is there?
No, there's not.
Why is that?
I don't know.
Because to the naked eye, it looks as if the survey conclusions were based solely on the 13-strong population of survey responses.
I could see how it could look that way. And as I say, sort of some 21, 22 years later, I would be most surprised if the IAG hadn't engaged on this. But I agree with you, so it doesn't read that way.
They may have engaged on it, I can see that, but they didn't carry out their own survey, did they? And then add the results of that survey to this?
No, sir.
No. We can see, in fact, if you go to page 7 of this document, that there's a figure, and we may need to have it enlarged. Please, if we could just expand it a bit. You can see figure 1, questionnaires returned by respondent type. And you can see the different colour coding. Mauve is issued, and then burgundy is returned, and beige is nil return, and then there's no response in, I think, light blue, yes. And if you look at that, you can see that the number of surveys actually returned by local authorities in England was 5, 3 in Scotland, 1 in Wales, yes?
Yes.
A total of 8. And there's an acknowledgement later on in the report, lower down on page 7, that some of the information might be duplicated. Let's just look at that if we can. If we scan out specifiers and suppliers, you can see that there's a risk of duplicates there. It's quite a long way, isn't it, on its face, from the, quotes, comprehensive survey of the UK building stock, close quotes, that was proposed in the bid for this document.
Yes, it is.
Do you know why that is?
Again, from recollection, the attempt was made to gather this data by means of this consultation. One presumes there were further attempts reaching back out, and that would tend to be insinuated by what you've kindly just shown me, and through discussions, as I say, with the IAG. But I believe this is the best that they could achieve with the engaging of this particular part of the industry.
If we go to page 10, you can see on that page, second bullet point, down under survey conclusions, it says, whilst no one clear system was identified, the majority of systems used by local authorities appears to be the render-based systems, with rain screen systems representing around 12% of the market. Did you yourself really consider that conclusions based on such a limited data set, some of which might have been duplicated, and in terms of rain screen systems represented such a fraction of the market, could be considered to be representative or reliable?
I can't recall, but I believe I would have considered that. And again, by virtue of who we had on the industry advisory group, which I recognise here isn't referred to, this would have been tested with both local authorities that we had on the group, representatives from building control, and the relevant trade associations.
The question really is, did you consider at the time that such a data set as it was, with the limitations that I think you've accepted, should have provided such a basis for a government-funded experimental testing programme of such importance to fire safety?
I can't recall, but I would have considered that. But again, and forgive me, I couldn't find any further information or minutes of meetings or emails from the IAG. Considerations would have taken place that, whilst limited in terms of responses, with the further engagement and discussion, there would have been a feeling and an understanding that this was representative going forward.
Did anybody, to the best of your recollection on the IAG, advise you, or anybody else in the department, that notwithstanding this small data set, it was fairly representative to form a robust and reliable base for going forward with government-funded experimental testing with importance to life safety?
I cannot recall.
Looking back, if we can, at the screen, can we scroll up a little bit higher up, page 10? And we see there fire breaks. Do you see?
Yes.
And it says, the final group of questions concentrated on fire prevention, mitigation and incidents. The use of fire barriers appears to be very sporadic, and typical responses included only fitted when asked or unknown. Fortunately, when asked about fire incidents, the majority had found no problems with external fire spread, although they had all experienced fire attack. Now, did the first sentence and second sentence there cause you any concern? Namely, the response along the lines of, or including, only fitted when asked, or unknown? Did that cause you any concern?
It would have piqued my interest, having a background in building control, and that's something that ultimately did go forward, because there was a discrete piece of work on cavity barriers ultimately let in between this period of work and what led into the 2006 revision of the approved document B. But that would have piqued my interest, and that would have formed part of the discussions with the industry advisory group.
Right, and what was that piece of work?
From recollection, because of a need to relook at the provision of cavity barriers within voids and around window openings, BRE undertook that work. It might have been Dr. Colwell, actually. Ultimately, looking at how better advice could be provided in the approved document B, and that would have been published and fed into, from recollection, the 2006 revision.
Yeah. Okay. Can I then ask you to look at page 12 of this document and paragraph, the second paragraph under the heading procurement. And it says this: it is evident that the insulation industry has a number of highly active lobbying groups. The approach taken by the two main factions, the mineral wool manufacturers and the polymeric core suppliers, has been one of highly aggressive marketing against their opposition. This has led to several articles in the construction press. Did you know, or were you told, of the identity of the companies this report was referring to in this section?
I wouldn't have known the specific companies, but in my experience of engagement with the industry, I was very much aware of this going on and the general disagreement between these two entities, both in terms of thermal performance and fire performance. I'd spoken at events as a regulator, and I'd seen sort of these two entities shout across the floor at each other in terms of their respective products. It was well known in the industry.
Did any element of that highly aggressive marketing, to use the word in the report, involve making extravagant claims for the fire safety of their product above 18 metres?
Not that I can recall. It was more a matter of just wanting to undermine each other's products more generally.
Right. So it's product disparagement rather than overblown statements about one's own product.
From recollection.
I see. Now, looking at the next paragraph, it says this: should the department choose to partner these companies for the supply and installation of their products for this project, they should be aware of this background. Experience suggests that the industry sector will wish to ensure the maximum publicity from this work to the detriment of their opposition, and this may prove difficult to manage. In addition, it is important to ensure that the work is independent and free from undue commercial influence, which is difficult to control when partnering with industry. Whilst we are happy to work with these organisations, it may be more politically expedient to purchase the materials and services on the open market in order to ensure that a level playing field is maintained in the marketplace. Now, as you say, those companies weren't known to you by name, and indeed they're not named in the report, but isn't it the case that the department would need to know who they were in order to be able to be informed properly when making decisions on whether to partner with industry for the supply of products for this project?
Not necessarily. As I understood from reading and being reminded of this, what was being discussed here was more about, as it says under the heading of procurement, how best to obtain product. We had various options. We could have gone through the various trade associations, and they would have definitively known which products they were provided in similar from either the plastic space side or the mineral fibre. And I took this to be a very sensible suggestion that actually we should go to the open market and bring these products in, because it had to be transparent and robust without any of this sort of lobbying potentially from either side.
I see. Was one of the concerns that these industry bodies, whether manufacturers or trade bodies, might attempt to bring undue commercial influence to bear on the research?
Not necessarily commercial influence on the research. They're more about actually making claims against one another.
Why would that matter? Why would that matter when you were selecting products?
Because I wouldn't, from a personal perspective, I wouldn't want the work to be detracted by press and claims and counterclaims. When we're undertaking a piece of research which is looking at what is potentially being experienced in the marketplace, it would be far better to obtain it from the marketplace.
I'm still not sure I really understand why the fact that one faction was making disparaging remarks against the other's product would somehow distort the way in which the department would acquire these products for the purposes of the testing programme. In short, so what? You buy the polymeric and test it, and you buy the mineral wool and you test that. Does it matter? Did it matter what the organisation selling these products was saying about each other's products?
Being purist, potentially not. But it could amount to a huge distraction when what we were trying to do is answer questions following the select committee. And so it was felt more expedient to undertake the purchase of these products from the marketplace.
I see. So is that a delicate way of saying that when carrying out the testing, you didn't want the department to be seen to be in thrall to one or other faction?
No. I mean, from our perspective, we sit there as a regulator. We set the regulatory vehicle in place, that is the building regulations. Typically, we don't ban products or similar. We set provisions to control the use to make sure products can be used safely to meet the functional requirements. From my perspective and from recollection, it was felt that it would be easier to procure them in this manner and not suffer with the potential distraction that might then follow.
The distraction being what?
So typically, if there was mudslinging going on in the marketplace, it could call into question even potentially the work that was happening. I suggest that could have been a risk, but it's just something we didn't want to get into. This was a piece of fundamental research to be undertaken.
Right. So again, let me try this again. It was the idea of going this route simply to clear away what you might regard as what we might call white noise, to distract from the outcomes of the tests.
Yes.
Let's turn to the testing programme then. Can we please go to page 12 of this document for lower down, and under the survey summary and options report, we can see two design options right at the foot of your screen, now in the middle of your screen. Option 1, fire note 9. And it says this: from the information provided in the survey, and in order to address the trend towards increasing thermal and acoustic performance in the residential housing market, the following experimental programme is proposed. This option does not provide any indication of the performance of built-up systems or pre-formed insulation panels. The tests will be carried out in accordance with BRE Fire Note 9 using the existing test facility at BRE Cardington. And then you have this: System Type 1, U-value equivalent to proposed draft BR 262, guide requirements, and you have set 1, rendered systems no fire barrier standard fixings, and there are 3 tests under that: mineral fibre, expanded polystyrene insulation, and phenolic foam insulation. And then repeat of set 1, tests 2 and 3 with fire barriers. And then if we turn the page to page 13, System Type 2, equivalent U values for System Type 1, Set 2, there are 4 tests there: metal faced on metal rail, mineral fibre insulation. Test 2, non-combustible panel or wooden battens, mineral fibre insulation. Test 3, Class 0 panel on metal rails, mineral fibre insulation. Test 4, Class 0 panel on wooden batten, mineral fibre insulation. And then repeat test, Set 2, tests 3 and 4 with fire barriers. And then there's a cost. Now, who designed that testing programme, option 1?
That would have been BRE.
It would have been BRE. Do you remember that? They came to you with this in their in the report.
From recollection, but this would have been first developed by BRE and potentially thereafter tested with the IAG. But it's coming through to me as client on the basis of what the best potential options for test would be.
Did you have any involvement yourself or input into this testing programme?
I would have received it as a client after due consideration by BRE.
Right. Do you know how the various components were chosen? Not in the sense of their branded product, but looking at what's on the screen, the metal-faced panel or metal rail. Do you know what the methodology was by which the BRE selected?
One would imagine it would have taken it back to the review of the marketplace, albeit I acknowledge the discussion we've just had on limitations, and testing again with the IAG as to are these the relevant products that are being experienced or coming onto the market. So there would have been, I would have expected consideration behind it.
Did the department ask the BRE to test specific considerations?
Not that I recall.
Right. Now, Dr. Colwell told us, and I should show you this in the transcript so we have her exact words. Can we please go to her evidence at day 232, page 76? And if you go to line 2, she says, that was discussions with the industry group, with the department and with ourselves. Fundamentally, it was the department's decision as to which route they wanted to take because they were sourcing the products that were being tested. Question, what was the rationale behind the approach which was eventually taken to do these 14 tests, including some on composite systems? How did they explain that to you? It was based on the information and guidance they had about the types of systems that were in the marketplace and needed. They needed to understand what those looked like in practice on the large-scale test. Question at line 16, did they have information which you didn't have about the types of systems that were in the marketplace and that they needed to understand? Or was their information all coming from you and the survey that you had done? Answer at line 21, I believe they were having their own discussions internally as well. I would suggest that they were obviously taking their own soundings. I would expect them to have been doing that. Question at 25, was the ultimate programme decided before testing began or did it change as the experimental programme was running? And then she says she doesn't remember. Now, down to the foot of the previous page, we can just go back to page 76, Mr. Burd. Is there anything in the evidence of Sarah Colwell there with which you would disagree?
Yes.
What, please?
From my perspective, as a client, as a regulator, we would have looked to BRE with the industry advisory group to discuss and consider and then come forward with recommendations for the test programme. Ultimately, yes, as the client, I would have signed off on that is the agreed programme. However, it would have been informed by the experts at BRE, by the industry advisory group therein. I would also, please forgive me, sir, touch upon, and this came up, I believe, in the start of my evidence on Thursday. There is a blend going on of a series of tests that were originally envisaged, and from recollection, it was then extended to do more testing, and this does add to a blend here. So it's not all in relation to what you've just shown me, sir.
No, that we've seen that. We may come to that in due course. In August 2001, there was a change in the programme. But your answer, I think, is that, in fact, the experts would have done their own work assisted by the IAG as to what in the market were the relevant configurations to be tested.
Yes, sir.
That's your recollection?
Yes.
Right. Taking the BRE alone, was it your expectation that they were designing the programme based on their own knowledge of what was common in the market?
Yes, but with an expectation that they would engage and inform that further.
Through
reaching out to industry and the likes of the IAG.
Was it your understanding at the time that the BRE, although a testing house and essentially a scientific advisory and experimental organisation, as we've been told, nonetheless had enough links to industry and your IAG to be able to inform themselves about what was and what wasn't common in the UK built environment that required testing?
Yes, and by virtue of that, as an example, one would envisage that the BRE were undertaking commercial testing of products in the marketplace with private clients, and that too would have, I presume, informed some of their understanding and appreciation of the market.
Did it inform your understanding at the time of the basis of their understanding?
I would have expected it to have fed into the reports coming forward and the testing criteria.
I see.
Regime.
That's a slightly different answer to my question, but nonetheless pertinent. So when you received this document, was it your understanding at the time that these tests were based on what the BRE had gleaned, either through themselves or through their contacts or through the IAG, about common construction systems?
Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you. Looking then, can we go back, please, to the report, page 12, option 2, right at the foot of your screen, and we need to roll up, please. Fire note, option 2 is modified fire note 9, and that says in the first paragraph, during discussions it has become increasingly obvious that there are several issues relating to the use of built-up systems and preformed insulation panels that should be addressed as part of this project. It should also be noted that the Joint British Standards Committee working on the Fire Note 9 test method is recommending that a Part 2 of the standard be developed to address the testing of built-up preformed insulation where no masonry wall is present and curtain wall systems. We currently have no experience of their fire behaviour in this scenario. Now, according to end note 8, just next to the word discussions, the text of which is at page 15, let's just go to that, you can see there that the discussions referred to at end note 8 were on the same day as the report, meeting at DETR 24th July 2000. You see that?
Yes.
Now, that's the same day as the date borne by the report itself, as we've seen. Do you recall that meeting?
No, I don't.
Do you recall there being a meeting on the very same day the report is dated?
We would have had meetings over the course of this contract.
Have you any recollection of the discussion that's referred to?
No, I do not, but just, this won't have passed you by, sir, but that was 22 years ago.
I know, it
Yeah.
hasn't passed me by.
No, no, sir.
No, and I understand that, but I'm really here just to dig around in your memory, showing you documents at the time and seeing if they can trigger a recollection of any kind. Do you recollect the discussions?
I do not recollect the discussions, but I would add, given the way in which we worked with our contractors, if it's down here as having a meeting, then I'm sure it would have happened, sir.
Right, okay. Now, can you tell us what the issues were relating to the use of built-up systems and preformed insulation panels that needed to be addressed as part of that proposal?
I cannot recall, as I've said, but I should imagine there would have been a discussion along the lines as what do we need to do as part of what the original contract was to cover in response to the House of Commons Select Committee recommendations, and then it might have amounted to a further discussion as to what else might be needed going forward, maybe in the form of additional testing.
Now, looking at the final paragraphs of page 13, if we can go back to that, please, 2 pages, it says this. Under the last paragraph there, it says, accepting the budgetary constraints associated with this project, the large-scale experimental programme may be better served by considering a modification to Fire Note 9 to allow built-up systems and preformed insulation panels to be tested. In order to undertake this change in test scenario, a new test facility would be required. The construction of such a facility would reduce the budget available for the purchase and supply of full-scale systems, but would provide a good basis on which to expand the scope of the existing guidance given in BR 135 to cover the emerging market trends for, we go over the page, which we currently have no data. This data could also be used to support the British Standards activity. It is not possible to offer fixed budgetary figures for this option, but should this proposal be considered worthy of further consideration, a costing could be obtained. Did it concern you at the time that there was no data in respect of emerging market trends?
As a regulator, it would have piqued my interest to understand that, and therefore, as I say, going forward, we would have considered what we could do within budgets to further glean that information. So yes, it would have. I can't recall reading it at the time, but that would have interested me, sir.
Right. And what did you do about it?
From my perspective, that was a point. That's the benefit of undertaking research, is to a point of learning to think about what further we might need to do in the future going forward.
Now, given the lack of data on emerging market trends, and given also that the data could support the conversion of Fire Note 9 into a British standard, which I think was running parallel with this work at the time, early 2000, did you consider proceeding with Fire Note 9? Option 2, a modified Fire Note 9.
I can't recall, sir, but we would have gone back to I think in time, to the budget holder within our division, which was Caroline Cousin at the time, and maybe looked upon working up any potential for more funding to be made available to extend this contract.
Did that happen?
From recollection, and given the work that was happening in BSI for BS 8414 Part 2, I believe it did.
Not until 2005, I think.
Okay, so
It came out in 2005. Now, the testing programme that was eventually undertaken and reported was different from either of these options 1 or 2, wasn't it?
I can't recall.
I mean, the total of 14 full-scale tests was carried out, yes?
If you say so.
Well,
yes.
right.
Yeah.
Do you not remember that?
No.
Right. And there was a third set of tests on composite panel systems, which was included. You don't remember that?
Not definitively, but I have no reason to doubt if it's here. So.
Can you explain why the testing that was done differed from what had been proposed in this document?
I envisage that would have been a discussion between BRE and the IAG. Maybe learnings were gleaned along the way that allowed them to pivot and think about undertaking alternative methods of test.
Right. Do you know how the testing programme that was eventually settled on was decided?
Again, that would have been further consideration of BRE in its understanding. I envisage they would have used the IAG, and then a recommendation to me as client for final say-so would have come forward.
So you would have been the person within government taking the ultimate decision to go with the testing system as ultimately carried out?
Yes.
Yes, I see. But you can't remember
No.
what led to the changes between or from the system as proposed and the system as eventually carried out?
I can only presume it was further consideration. Again, when you're working to a budget, and I'm no expert on undertaking research of this nature, but if they can alter some of the tests, which allows them to then gather data which precludes one of the other tests, which unlocks that space to test some other product, that's how they'll try and to work the arrangements. But if that happened, I can't recall.
Can we go then, please, to BRE 406285? Now, this is an email of the 10th of August 2001, which I think you touched on earlier in your recollection. And it's from Sarah Colwell to you, copy to Debbie Smith and Peter Field. Subject, contract CC 1924, fire performance of external cladding systems. Now, do you remember that this was mid-programme, which I think had started in the May of 2001 and ran till November?
I can't recall the email.
Right. Now, if we cast your eye down the email, it's long and complex, but if we turn, please, to the second page, page 2, we can see that in the final 3 paragraphs on that page, she's proposing, in outline terms, proposing changes to the testing programme, mid-programme. Do you remember that as an event?
No, I do not, but as I described before you showed me this document, so that might not be uncommon, because as you start to gather data and actual test data, the learnings increase, and it might then allow consideration of what's to come in terms of testing. It might be felt actually something else isn't needed, and so they'd make the change and have to come to client to agree that.
Right, and then in the last paragraph, she's proposing a meeting at which to discuss the changes to the project and the financial impacts of that. Do you remember that?
I don't remember the meeting, but if, as I say, we enjoyed a good relationship with our contractors, and given the amount of public spend on contracts such as this, I have no doubt the meeting took place.
Right. Now, did you, in fact, approve these proposals for changes relating to the testing programme?
I envisage I would have, ultimately, yes.
Now, we'll come back to this email in due course, but if you go, please, to page 1, you can see that there is an identification of some of the products. So, for example, midway down your screen, you can see that underneath the first list of 6 system types, there's a reference in the second sentence there to Reso Plan. It says Reso Plan was used as the Class 0 product. And lower down the page, there's a reference, as you can see in the last paragraph on your screen there, to Rock Panel. You see that?
Yes.
we can see those specific products. We don't see identification of the aluminium panels referred to in item 3 on the page in the middle of your screen. Aluminium panels on aluminium rails, no fire breaks. We don't see that.
I do, sir, yes.
Yeah, now why, do you know why that product wasn't identified?
No, I do not.
If we look at the penultimate paragraph on that page, it says this: the results from the tests to date show that the aluminium panels produce a significant fire. Now, given that the aluminium panels produced a significant fire, as Dr. Colwell was telling you, did you not think to ask what that product was?
I cannot recall. I should imagine we'd have spoken this through, and Sarah would have explained all aspects of this, so it might have come up in the discussion.
Right, but nothing in your head right
No.
now? No. Now, going back to the suggested options for full-scale testing...
Well, can I just ask, when you read aluminium panels, what did you understand that to mean?
As written, sir, but the fact it produced a significant fire, as I say, probably would have led to some discussion as to what insulation might have been affiliated with in the test, or in terms of it being a panel, what it might have in it, its core. But yes, sir.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Right, well, just building on your answer to the chairman's question,
Yes.
there are two parts to it. One is curiosity about what the insulation was with which the panel was affiliated, and the other was what it might have in its core. Does that tell us that at this time, so August 2001, you at least were aware that there were out there in the market aluminium rain screen panels with a core?
From recollection, there would have been panels that had polyurethane and polyisocyanurate potentially within. I'm trying to recall. But again, typically at this time, it would have been in relation to what sort of thermal insulation material. In readiness for appearing, I have come back and looked at some of these papers, and there are references to aluminium panels and aluminium sheets. But there would have been a discussion at some point, certainly with the IAG, as to why that would have been a significant fire.
Yes, we'll come to that shortly.
Yes.
I'm just interested in the state of your knowledge, to the best you can recall it, in late summer 2001, about the presence of aluminium composite material panels in the UK built environment.
At that time, it primarily would have been in relation to what we more typically call sandwich panels. So potentially aluminium with, as I've said already, polyurethane and polyisocyanurate. That would have been my understanding of the types of products at that time.
Right, and you typically called them sandwich panels. Were those products used, to the best of your recollection and knowledge at the time, on the external face of a building?
Potentially, they could have been.
Yeah, but were they? And was it your understanding that they were out there on the external face of high-rise buildings?
Not necessarily on the external face of high-rise residential buildings, but those are the sorts of products with polystyrene as well that were being utilised on large single-storey retail buildings and similar.
Right.
Not necessarily, in relation to those sorts of out-of-town developments for shops and DIY stores.
What if they were only being used on single-storey buildings, then why test them under this test programme, which was a test programme designed around the BS 8414 test? I say around it, designed on the basis of the principles contained in it.
But as you showed me on Thursday, sir, this was one example of a potential product that was coming forward. I think there were costs affiliated with the Architect's Journal. So I just envisaged that fed in to help formulate what the test regime might look like.
Now, can we go, please, to let me take it more shortly. In fact, the tests that were set out in under the rendered system tests in set 1, which were tests 2 and 3 we saw earlier, weren't all repeated with fire barriers, were they?
Not that I can recall.
No. Do you know why that was?
No, I don't.
And similarly, the ventilated rain screen systems in set 2, tests 3 and 4, they also were not repeated with fire barriers. Again, do you know why that was?
No, I do not.
Right. In fact, did you know that of the 14 full-scale tests undertaken in the end, only 2 render and rain screen, one render, one rain screen, contained fire barriers? Did you know that?
I would have at the time,
Yes.
and there would have been discussions with the IAG as to why that be the case.
And what was the upshot of those discussions?
I should imagine there was interest in testing the actual product itself in terms of the outer external part of the product, and therefore one would envisage that you'd get better performance if you had cavity barriers within the voids.
Right.
But that's me just trying to recall.
Right, and do you remember who you discussed this with at the IAG? Or on the IAG?
From my recollection, it would have been discussed generally as an item.
And when you refer to testing the actual product itself, do you mean small-scale or bench-scale tests? As opposed to a full system test?
Apologies, is this not the full system?
This is the full scale. This is the full system
Yeah,
test.
well, you wouldn't typically utilise cavity barriers in small scale and bench tests necessarily.
No.
No.
So what would you exactly? That's right.
So I envisage I envisage it would have been in relation to the full scale test.
Right. Oh, I see. Right. Now, can we then go to BRE 30418882? And we can see on page 1 that this is an analysis report. We'll wait for it to come. BRE 30418882, client report, analysis of ISO 9705, European and British standard fire test data for BR135 project, and it's prepared for you, and it's dated the 19th of September 2002. And note the date, Mr. Burd, and I'm going to call it the analysis report, but remember it bears that date. If we go to page 5 of this document, there is an introduction section. And if you look at it, it tells us in the second paragraph there that 14 full-scale fire tests were undertaken using the Fire Note 9 test methodology. The results from this work are presented in BRE Report 209169 Revision 1. The systems identified and tested at full scale were also assessed at intermediate and bench scale using the following test methods. And there are, as you see, the first 2 bullet points are the national classification, which would lead to a Class 0 classification, and the last 3 are part of the Euroclass testing regime. Yes? Yes. If we go, we're going to come back to this document in due course, probably back and forth, but if we go for the moment to the BRE's closing report for this project, dated 3 days beforehand, the 16th of September 2002. That is at BRE 30418895. Can we go to that? I'll show you the first page of that. It's called ODPM Closing Report, prepared for you, dated the 16th of September 2002.
Yes.
So you've got these reports 3 days apart. If you go to page 9 in that, you can see that there is a list there of the 14 full-scale tests which were carried out under Table 1, Initial Experimental Programme. You see that?
Yes.
5 under rain screen, 5 under render, and 4 under composite panel systems, with the description of each of the main components in each test. Now, again, you can see identification of the rock panel and Resoplan products and Rockwool as a core, as you can see from, for example, the render system test item 5. Do you know why the other specific products are not identified by reference to the product name and manufacturer?
No, I do not.
Did it strike you at the time that that is something you ought to know?
I suppose when you look at the name Rockwool, it's quite synonymous in the marketplace as being the largest player. But it's only you pointing it out now, sir, that I see it there in terms of it's being treated the same way it would have said mineral fibre, mineral fibre or rock fibre. So No, I wasn't aware of that.
You weren't? And
no.
It would follow from that, I think, that you didn't at the time know the identity of the specific products and manufacturers and didn't ask.
Correct. Not that I can recall. There might have been discussions with BRE as to some of the products. I can't recall, sir.
Well, let's see how we go focusing
Yeah.
on the specific products. Dr. Colwell told us in her evidence, and I'll just give you the reference, it's day 232, page 84, lines 5 to 15, that information was known at the time, but it was the department's decision not to put the actual manufacturer's details or full specifications into these types of reports. That was her evidence. Is she right about that?
Yes.
So there was a decision, notwithstanding that the department knew what these products were, not to identify them on the face of the BRE's report.
Sorry, I'm getting confused. So are you in relation to not identifying these products in the closing report just for the department? Or are you talking more generally about not actually setting out who the manufacturers were for the wider consideration by IAG and similar?
Well, you're asking me.
Sorry.
Well, which is it? I mean, first of all, let's take it in stages. Is she right? I think you agreed that she was right that the identity of the product and the manufacturer was known to the BRE at the time.
It would have been known to the BRE.
Yeah. Was it known to the department at the time?
I can't recall, but
Right.
No, I can't recall.
Was a decision taken by the department not to identify the products on the face of the report given by the BRE to the department?
There was no decision made by us to say, do not place the names of products in there.
Right.
What I was referring to, sir, was in relation to the wider availability of ultimately the work to the IAG and ultimately the BSI committee. As we touched upon at the start, given the concerns and, dare I say, the mudslinging going on between the relevant parts of the industry, it was those reports where they weren't providing definitive trade names. They should have been providing discrete but suitably detailed definitions of what they had tested.
When you saw this report, did it occur to you to ask the BRE to identify for example, the aluminium sheet by product and by manufacturer in the same way that they identified rock panel, rock wool and Reseplan?
I don't recall, but it's only you pointing out that it says rock wool there now that I realised it wasn't named there.
Right. So is it your evidence that although the BRE knew what this was, there was no decision by the department not to know it for itself?
It was correct.
That's right.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Now, we looked earlier at the advice given by the BRE to the department in the survey summary and options report relating to partnering with manufacturers and the potential dangers in that. Had the department decided to follow that advice?
Yes.
Do you know who funded the full-scale testing?
It would have been the department.
No partnering with industry then?
Not from recollection, no. No,
Right.
It would have been departmental, publicly funded.
So can you be clear, there were no manufacturers or industry organisations involved in funding any of these tests?
That's correct.
And can you confirm that the products which were incorporated into these tests, whether or not identified, were bought on the open market?
From recollection, BRE engaged a third party to help them do that, so that is correct.
Do you know who that was?
No, I don't.
Did you do any due diligence on whether they were the sorts of people who should be involved in that sort of procurement exercise?
I can't recall if I did, but typically I wouldn't have undertaken such work because the expectation and the contract resided with the BRE, and they were used to undertaking such tasks to bring products in for testing.
So you had no oversight of that and no supervisory role in relation to that procurement exercise? No. And then, sticking with Table 1, looking at Set 2, if we can, which is entitled Rain Screen Systems, Set 2, which was Set 2 in the report, Item 5, aluminium sheets. Were you aware that this was a polyethylene cord ACM panel?
Not that I could recall.
That was Sarah Colwell's evidence. And in fact, it's clear in the BRE analysis. But you don't recall being aware of that fact. You may not recall it, but can you deny it, sitting there now?
No, I can't deny it, no, sir.
Did you attend the test?
Of that product?
Yes.
I don't believe so, no.
Now, looking more closely at the results of the testing on the rain screen system with the PE cord aluminium cladding, can we go to page 23 of BRE 000418882, which is the analysis report? That's BRE 41882, page 23. This is table 8, and you can see the results for test 5. Aluminium sheets mounted on aluminium rails, no fire barriers. And then across the page are some figures. Now, looking at those figures, are you able to understand them?
Yes,
More or less.
Yeah.
Do you agree that that system reached the Fire Note 9 failure criteria, as it then was, extremely rapidly?
Yes.
And if you look along row 5, you can see that the time to external failure was 3.0 minutes.
Yes.
Yes. And the time to internal failure, which is insulation, was 4.34 minutes. Yes.
Yes.
That is a very poor result, isn't it?
My understanding it is, sir.
Were you surprised by it?
It would have warranted discussion.
Well, yes,
So
but were you
yes.
surprised by it?
Yes.
Yes. Now, this was a Class 0 product, wasn't it?
I understand so, yes.
Yes, we're going to come on to it. It is confirmed in this report at page 11, but we'll look at that in a moment. But if we go to page 3 of the closing report, 3 days before, that's BRE 30's 41911, at page 3, we can see the detailed observations from this test, the results of which we've just seen.
Yes.
There they are.
Yes.
Rain screen 3, aluminium plus iso wool on metal, and there's a number.
Yeah.
Do you know who recorded those observations?
No, I do not.
And you can see that at 3 minutes and 5 seconds, molten aluminium drops off front face, yes?
Yes.
Do you remember reading that particular observation?
I don't remember reading it.
Do you remember reading this set of observations?
No, I don't. But the data you showed me previously, sir, had shown me the pace at which the test had proceeded. But I don't specifically remember reading this.
Do you remember seeing that at 4 minutes and 20 seconds, the flames had reached the top of the rig, 10 metres?
I don't recall seeing it, as I've already said, but as I say, I envisage that given all of the results, this would have been discussed with the IAG and similar. So I would envisage a discussion would have taken place.
And looking at the results, 2 down from that, 5 minutes, flame approximately twice height of rig, 20 metres. Do you remember noting that?
I'm sure I did.
What did you conclude from it?
I suppose the backdrop to this, of course, is as well that this is a full-scale test, and it is being utilised to work through what the pass-fail criteria should be for it ultimately. And I would have thought, in addition to the other failures, that it was imperative that obviously this insight and learning fed into the work that was to take next place within BSI and on BR 135 to make sure that this was captured. So in the undertaking of a full-scale test, this would fail.
Yes, I mean, one could describe the results in different human terms, but would you agree that this is a catastrophic escalation of a fire?
It's a very fierce, fast fire.
Yes. And were you alarmed when you saw the results and the chronology? Did you have any...
As I say, I'm trying to recall, but given this, there would have been discussions where this was described to us by BRE, so it would have focused my attention, yes.
And in focusing your attention, do you recall the BRE communicating their own sense of shock that they had felt when observing this test and its results?
No, I cannot.
Who was it within the BRE with whom you discussed this result?
I can't recall, but I would envisage it would have been at whatever point with the IAG or in providing an update, it would have been Dr. Colwell.
Right. Now, who at the IAG would you have had these discussions?
Again, I'm trying to recall, in terms of making the information available to the IAG, there could have been just a broad discussion as to where they were finding results that would be of concern or of relevance. But thinking about who we had on there, the other regulators, my equivalents, would have had an interest in this. The representative from Building Control and some of the relevant trade associations. I believe we had the relevant trade association for the aluminium sector. So I envisaged they would have had interest in this too.
And what did they say?
I can't even recall the discussion. So
Right. Did you have a structured system of meeting them after the results and these reports came in? Did you have a formal meeting with them to discuss the results and what should be done about it?
I should imagine it would have been a blend of meetings and emails and similar.
Right.
I can't recall.
Right. Do you remember what the IAG told you about this test?
No, I can't recall, sir.
Whose responsibility was it to brief you or explain to you the significance of these results?
That would have been BRE.
Did they?
I can't recall ever being told in terms of the severity of what was witnessed. But that's not to say I wasn't taken through some of the broad findings. But I can't recall, sir.
Did the severity of what was witnessed leap out at you from the documents?
I think it would have at the time, in addition to the other areas of potential failure and what that might mean for the approved document and the pass-fail criteria for what we have before us here.
Do you accept that as a result of this test, what you saw on the page and your discussions perhaps with Sarah Colwell and the IAG, that you, the British government, was aware from this time on, 2002, how ACM with a polyethylene core panel could behave in a fire?
I would recognise, yes, sir, that we had more insight in terms of this type of performance. I don't recognise, or I wouldn't have recognised at the time, it would have been called an ACM, but there would have been insight and sufficient learning for us to then ensure that this go forward into BSI for consideration for pass-fail criteria in the writing of the new national standard. And I would have gone back and reminded myself of the guidance that sits in and supports the approved document B.
Would you have realised that this panel, looking at approved document B, notwithstanding its performance in a full-scale test, nonetheless had class 0, and therefore would have been permitted, was permitted, under what was then, I think, it changed, but what was then, I think, 13.6 of approved document B and diagram 36?
From my perspective, and this is where I can't recall the discussions with the likes of the IAG and similar, but this sort of product would not have been acceptable under the building regulations because of the guidance in section 13 of the approved document B.
Was any consideration given to making it clear that this kind of product should not be used above 18 metres?
As I say, sir, it is my understanding and recollection of the ADB 2000 and the guidance therein that this product wouldn't have been allowed.
Did you sit down with the result on one side of your desk and ADB 2000 dating from July of that year and work through the language of ADB to satisfy yourself that this product would not have been allowed by ADB?
I can't say I'd have undertaken that explicit task, sir, but just looking at the results, it wouldn't have met the functional requirements of the approved document,
Did you,
of the regulations.
Did you take anything from the fact that even though it wouldn't have met the functional requirements, for obvious reasons, I think we can agree that, nonetheless, the product bore Class 0 and let it be assumed, had successfully passed BS 476 Parts 6 and 7?
That would have formed part of my consideration. But not just the functional requirement, I would have drawn back to, let's say, maybe in paragraph 13.6, which talks about the dangers on tall buildings of combustible material. And specifically within 13.6 as well, it refers to the fact, an acknowledgement that these products might also be Class 0.
Now, just follow this through with me. It sounds as if you gave consideration after this test to the fact that there was a risk posed to occupants of high-rise buildings where ACM polyethylene panels had been applied as part of the external system.
I would have considered these results and the other failures, as would, I envisage, the IAG members, which, as I say, covered those that would have had concern. And I would have circled back to think about, could they be used? Are they being definitively used above tall buildings? And actually, with the focus on the large-scale testing, it was, from my perspective, it was good that this has been found, and it can go forward for consideration in the BSI committee and in the pass-fail criteria for BR135.
Right. Now, you told us, to be fair to you, you told us earlier that your experience in the main of these kinds of panels was as sandwich panels on low-storey buildings. It sounds from what you're telling us that even though that was the case, you nonetheless did apply your mind at the time to the risks to life of the use of these panels in buildings above 18 metres.
That consideration would have taken place.
Right. This product was being used in a government-funded experimental programme specifically because it was either typical or at least an emerging product in the high-rise cladding market and therefore fit to be tested in the public interest. Yes. Did anybody in the department consider alerting industry or local authorities or building control bodies or building owners to this result and the obvious dangers posed to occupants of buildings which had been clad with this material?
All the people that you've named were certainly on the industry advisory group. And by virtue of, albeit generic data being moved into the BSI committee, information had been shared therein. But again, from recollection, there would have been my consideration, the IAG's consideration, that actually the approved document, circling back to the functional requirements and the performance statements, that this wasn't being utilised in those sorts of environments. So again, I can't recall, but there could have been a discussion with building control rep on the IAG potentially, and maybe some greater understanding as to how these products were being actually used in the marketplace and actually how popular they were and how commonplace.
You say there could have been a discussion along those lines.
I can't recall.
You can't recall?
I can't recall, sir.
Now, given the extremely, and I'm suggesting to you, extremely concerning results of this test, was any consideration given by government, you in particular, about whether any specific intervention into the use of PE called ACM on buildings above 18 metres was necessary?
Again, I can't recall specifically, but there would have been consideration of the findings and the fact, again, it was shared out to the IAG members and to BSI, and the discussion, my appreciation that it wouldn't have met the functional requirements meant that I was just happy that it was going forward to ensure that pass-fail criteria for the large scale meant it would never pass, and that actually the functional requirements and the extant approved document B at the time was sufficient.
Mr. Chairman, we're mid-topic, but is now a convenient moment for the morning break.
Yes, I think it is. We'll have a break at this stage then. Mr. Burd will come back at 11:30. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Millett. 11:30, please. Would you ask Mr. Burd to come back in, please? Thank you. All right, Mr. Burd,
Yes, sir.
ready to carry on? Thank you. Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, Mr. Burd, we are at mid-September 2002, and we've been looking at the closing report and the analysis report of the 16th and the 19th of September, respectively. Now, at the time, as a result of seeing this test result, and perhaps your discussions with the BRE and the IAG at the time, did anybody in government consider trying to ascertain how many buildings had already been clad with ACM panels with a polyethylene core?
From recollection, again, this would have been a point that I envisaged what we would have explored with the industry advisory group, just to see the propensity of use of these documents.
Products.
Products, sir, sorry. But I don't recall any further discussion to that.
Right. Would it not have added to the importance of having an accurate survey of building types to know what was out there definitively in the built environment?
I suggest that would have been of assistance, sir, and therefore thinking through, and obviously with the benefit of hindsight now as well, perhaps a recommendation to look at further work could have been useful. But again, I would revert back that those sorts of discussions, I'm sure we would have discussed them amongst the regulators and the industry on the advisory group.
Did you come to a conclusion, regardless of what and when and with whom those discussions might or might not have taken place, did you come to a conclusion that no survey of the built environment was necessary?
I don't believe I came to that conclusion.
Did you therefore come to the conclusion to the opposite effect, that such a survey was necessary?
Again, I can't recall the discussion or my considerations at the time, but perhaps consideration of something further to understand what was happening in the marketplace in addition might have happened. But I think looking at the findings we had and the fact that, in my opinion, it didn't meet the building regulations, and the fact that this was going forward and being raised with the relevant BSI committee and similar, there would be additional engagement with the industry there too.
You see, on the one hand, your view was that this product or type of product wouldn't comply, but on the other hand, you were testing it, and one of the reasons you were testing it was because of the Architects Journal's identification of this product as one which you thought and the BRE thought was worth testing. Those are in conflict, aren't they?
Not necessarily, sir. As we covered on Thursday, it's useful to understand what's happening in the marketplace, and whilst that type of system was referred to in the AJ, from recollection of the table you showed in the BRE report, there was no indication of these products being used as, the degree of use or where they were being used. And so it's reasonable to test products that do come forward.
But given that it's reasonable to test such products, and given the result, why wouldn't it be reasonable, more than reasonable, essential, now then to find out, well, where are these products being used on high-rise buildings where they might be a danger to life? Is this a one-off, or is this a negligible handful which we can address on a one-by-one basis, or is there an endemic problem?
I could see how it'd be viewed in that way, but I can't recall such discussions or thoughts and considerations.
Right. Now, the BRE, Colwell's evidence at day 232, page 105, lines 7 to 17, was to the effect that they expected you to tell them whether or not that was something that you wanted advice on.
Sorry, sir, could you repeat the
Let
question?
me try it slightly differently. Do you agree that, or do you know that it was the BRE's view that having made you aware of the result, it was up to you to decide what you wanted to do with it?
I wasn't aware of that, but by virtue of the work hadn't been completed yet, with the view of the likes of BR 135 being prepared and engagement with the BSI relevant joint committee, and from recollection, some dissemination by Dr. Colwell in might have been a series of presentations to industry, one would envisage that it wouldn't just be to me as within the department to sort of engage the industry as to what we'd learnt from these full-scale tests, and there were other failures there too. It was a collective to understand and, where relevant, perhaps inform marketplace of these findings.
Were you aware that the BRE's view, Dr. Smith's own view, was at the time that ACM panels with a polyethylene core should never, ever be used on an external wall above 18 metres?
I can't recall having that discussion, but given Dr. Smith's expertise and looking at the performance, it doesn't surprise me that she would have thought that.
No, I'm really asking you whether you knew that that was her opinion, or the BRE's opinion at the time, that ACM panels with a polyethylene core should never, ever be used above 18 metres.
I can't recall having that definitive discussion, but looking at the performance, and then by virtue of its performance in the full-scale test, setting pass-fail criteria that would ensure it wouldn't pass going forward, I could see that that would be the thought. Yeah.
Do you know why that view was never enshrined into government policy?
As I said prior to the break, sir, when one looks at what was then the extant approved document B, and the way I read it as a regulator, both in terms of the provisions within section 13, and of course the functional requirement and performance statement, I suggest it was within and contained the building regulations and guidance there too, so it shouldn't have been used on tall buildings.
Was that your view at the time?
Yes, I believe it was.
And we'll come back to that answer in due course. I think a number of times perhaps as we go through the various iterations
Sure.
of approved document B. But do you accept that the government's failure to act on that research made possible the situation where ACM panels with a polyethylene core could be used in refurbishment of tall buildings such as Grenfell Tower?
I would suggest not, sir, for the reason being that such refurbishments would have to comply with the building regulations of the day. And in terms of the extant guidance in 2000, that would have suggested that they shouldn't have been used.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Millett, but I think it's worth just flushing a point out here. We've seen that the diagrams suggest that a Class 0 product is acceptable over 18 metres.
Yes, sir.
We've also seen that there is what we've described as the linear route to compliance, which is a step-by-step process, so to speak, culminating in the Class 0 for the rain screen panel. As I understand it, your evidence is that that is all overridden by the warning in whichever paragraph it is, depending on the edition, that there may be problems if you use combustible materials together.
Yes, sir.
Right. And your view, I think, this is what you're telling us, is that that warning was sufficiently strong and clear to override the express permission to use Class 0 materials.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry to keep doing this, but when I refer back to section 13.5 or section 13.6, and the overarching provision there that talks about that any combustibles could be problematic.
Could be problematic.
Could be problematic.
Right.
for the purposes of life safety. I believe it's that same paragraph that then alludes, well, that doesn't allude, it sets out to the reader, and that includes products that might meet diagram 40, if it was diagram 40, and achieve class 0. So what it was expressing to the reader is, think about what you've got. Even if you show compliance with the external surfaces diagram, still think about what else might be beneath it or included within the system.
Well, this is why I'm suggesting that if I understand your evidence, it is that that warning was sufficiently strong and clear to override the linear route provisions, including class 0, so as to ensure that the functional requirement was preeminent.
Yes, sir.
Did it ever occur to you that there might be people reading ADB who would not get that message because it was not sufficiently clearly worded?
I suppose there is always that potential risk, and I can only speak of a time when I was working building control and then I became a regulator, is that we were always taught to read all of the approved document or the relevant parts. But yes, so that risk, that is a possibility.
I mean, sometimes you have to write guidance or even rules for the sort of people who are not as careful as you are.
Yes, sir.
Did that cross your mind?
I don't believe it did at the time, sir.
All right. Well, I'm sure we're going to come back to this,
Yeah.
and we'll have to come back to it in the context of the actual language that's
Of
used.
course, sir.
But I just wanted to
Yes.
get that out clear. Yes, Mr. Williams. Sorry to interrupt.
It's on point. And my question was about to be, did you, after seeing these results, sit down and ask yourself whether the reader of approved document B, and in this case it would have been sectional, paragraph 13.7 of the 2000 version of ADB, whether the words in 13.7, which told the reader that the use of combustible materials in the cladding framework or as use in overcladding or ventilated cavities may present such a risk in tall buildings, notwithstanding the provisions in diagram 40 as it was at that stage and then remained, may have been satisfied. Did you sit down with those words and ask yourself whether those words and the rest of approved document B were sufficiently clear so that the reader would know that a Class 0 ACM polyethylene core panel was banned?
I believe I would have sat down and looked through, and to pick up Chairman's point as well, in terms of those that might be interpreting it, which could have included, of course, designers and specifiers. But by the same token, building work is controlled under building regulations, and so it would have been mounted to an application to building control. And well, anybody, quite frankly, that's been working in the realm of building control knows full well that you always revert to the functional requirement. And so, yes, looking at the calibre and the levels of competency in the industry, maybe some people didn't interpret it that way. But the catch, thankfully, that exists within the building regulation system is that there was building control sat behind that to consider it therein. So with the collective of designers, specifiers and building control, I would have felt it would have been caught, it would have been seen.
Now, it's right, isn't it, that not a single one of the rain screen systems tested, 1 to 5, under the rain screen systems that we saw in the analysis report, passed these full-scale tests and met the requirements of BRE Fire Note 9, as it then was?
That's my understanding.
Yeah. And that was regardless, wasn't it, of the combustibility or the national or European classification of the rain screen product, and regardless of the provision of fire barriers, cavity barriers.
From recollection, yeah.
Yeah. Did that surprise you? Did that overall result surprise you?
I would have noticed the degree of failure. That would have perhaps teased out as well the role of cavity barriers and installation. But one supposes at the time, looking back, to have that data was really useful to then make sure that again, for the full-scale test situation, it could be considered. But again, I would have put it in the context of, would that have shown compliance with what we call the linear route? So, yes, to answer your question, sorry,
Yes.
sir. It did surprise me, but I felt that the guidance in the approved document and the regulations would deal with it.
Because of the words I read to you from 13.7.
That would be part of it, but again, the reverting back to the functional requirement and the Secretary of State's performance statement, talking about the use of controlling the parts of a system in terms of heat release. Yes.
And the performance requirements which sit between
Yes.
the functional requirements
Yes,
and
sir.
the guidance. Were you aware at this time, so September 2002, of Dr. Smith's view, Debbie Smith's view, that Class 0 was at least questionable as a classification for a product to be used as part of the external wall over 18 metres?
You asked me this question, or a variant of it, on Thursday, and I couldn't quite recall, but by virtue of thinking back and reappraising, looking at papers and similar, yes, I am aware that Dr. Debbie Smith would have thought an alternative test might have been more befitting.
Right. I mean, her view is set out in her statement. Let's go to it rather than my trying to paraphrase it. BRE 405624, please, page 8, paragraph 24. You can see that she says, having referred to the Knowsley Heights fire in 1991, in the middle of the paragraph, this was a clear recognition that it was not possible to rely on small-scale fire test data on individual elements, materials or components in a cladding system as a means to try to predict and thereby control the fire performance. Reliance on small-scale fire tests had been tried and had been shown to be inadequate. Did you know that that was her opinion in 2002?
I don't know if I knew it in 2002 definitively, but over the course of certainly discussions and developments in the European test methodology, that would have become clear.
Right. Now, that exercise we're going to come to in due course, but that was happening in 2001, wasn't it?
From recollection, yes.
May and 2001, and then again in April 2002. So that discussion had already happened by the time you received the closing report on the 16th of September and the analysis report on the 19th of September 2002, wouldn't it?
Yes.
So you would have known it by that point?
I would have thought so, sir.
Yes. Thank you. Now, if we go back to the analysis report, please, at BRE 3041882, page 11, you can see there that there's a heading, BS 476 Parts 6 and 7, and it says this: the results from BS 476 Parts 6 and 7 are presented in Table 2. The results from these tests were not as expected, with only 4 of the 11 products achieving Class 0. All the materials tested were believed to be Class 0 products when purchased for this project. Now, just pausing there, did you ask what the basis was for the BRE's belief that all of those products were Class 0, genuinely Class 0?
I can't recall, but given the importance of the comment, we would have discussed that.
Right. And what did Dr. Colwell tell you, or the BRE tell you?
As I say, I can't recall, but the things we would have considered would have been, were the correct products definitively gleaned from the marketplace and purchased? And if so, what are the potential reasons for these Class 0 products potentially, as tested, not passing the requisite parts 6 and 7 in the right way to achieve Class 0?
What did you conclude?
I can't recall. As you say, we might have had a discussion, certainly if Dr. Debbie Smith was also involved, as to what that might mean and what we could glean from what was happening under the radar work. But for me, we would have discussed it both from in terms of what that might mean broadly to the marketplace, but we'd have also discussed it for almost the here and now of the work underway to see what we should do about those that were tested if they were Class 0, what recourse there needed to be.
To explain this unexpected rate of failure, did you consider the possibility that 7 out of the 11 suppliers and manufacturers had misrepresented their product classifications? Did you consider that possibility?
I can't recall, but it must have been a consideration.
Another consideration was that there were very serious reproducibility issues with testing to BS 476 parts 6 and 7. Did you consider that as an alternative possibility?
I can't recall, but potentially I did.
I mean, either of those possibilities, do you agree, would have been a matter of very serious concern?
I agree.
Is there any other explanation for these unexpected results?
Other than we weren't testing Class 0 products, as I say, they were achieved through a third party, and so one would envisage that there was some recourse there to make sure that they were testing the appropriate products. And from recollection, as I say, running concurrently with some crossover with the radar work, perhaps there was some work undertaken to just compare what the results were like coming from that work as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm really putting to you is either of these possibilities, either the manufacturers weren't telling the truth about the Class 0 classification, which they claim for their product, which would be one serious concern,
Yes.
and the other serious concern would be that they had genuinely tested it to 476 Part 6 and 7 and got a genuine Class 0 classification, but when the BRE did it, they didn't, which is a reproducibility problem. That would also have given rise to a very serious concern.
It would have.
Yes. Is there any alternative to those, or further alternative to those two possibilities that I've just put to you?
Not that I can think of
No.
while sat here.
So would that tell us that whatever the reasons for these unexpected results, they came as something of, to put it neutrally, a surprise to government?
As I say, I can't recall the considerations, but I think that would be a fair statement, sir.
Was any consideration given to you, by you or anybody else in government at the time, to withdrawing diagram 40 from approved document B?
Not that I can recall, no, sir.
What about the reference within diagram 40 to Class 0? In fact, I think at this time, I think I'm right in saying, this being September, this was a month before the October revisions, which introduced Class B as the alternative.
The problem we would have had if we'd had undertaken that, though, is that whilst the European test methods were coming, many products may not have actually been tested to those, potentially. And so we couldn't just, as your question says, just remove Class 0 necessarily if we thought that was right, and that would be subject to probably further consideration. And so, again, it would have been down to future considerations as to what we do or don't do in relation to the guidance in approved document P.
Right. Well, we're going to come to the harmonisation project with which I know you were involved, and the transition periods in due course in your evidence. But I'm getting ahead a little bit in topic terms. But given the surprising results from BS 476 Part 6 and 7 at this time, September 2002, was any thought given to making sure that Class 0 was removed from diagram 40, removed from ADB altogether at this time, because of the empirical evidence you'd seen?
No, I don't believe it was, from recollection. But that wouldn't have precluded, and forgive me, I don't know if this discussion happened, whether some more additional work could have taken place, as you've already offered and suggested, sir, that perhaps it wasn't particularly a large sample that was tested here, of whether other work could be undertaken to consider the actual performance of products that were being placed on the market. And I've already said it, and sorry to repeat myself, but that might well have fed into some discussions of what was coming forward from the radar work if we were seeing similar happenings there.
Right. You may not have precluded it, but do you recall any positive decision to get on and do further tests about the adequacy of BS 476 Parts 6 and 7, the adequacy and safety of Class 0 in continuing to regulate the nature of the surface of an external wall above 18 metres?
No, I don't. But you won't be surprised for me to again say, depending upon the use of the product, its location, its use, the building in question, Class 0 quite often doesn't sit alone as the only provision. And I understand the concerns about the performance of Class 0, but if it was felt that additional control was needed, such as using materials of limited combustibility or similar, that was an option that was conveyed within the approved document B.
I'm not sure. Forgive me. I'm not sure I understand that.
Sorry, sir.
When you say it was felt that additional control was needed, if it was felt additional control was needed, that was an option that was conveyed within the approved document B.
Forgive me. What I'm trying to say, sir, is that if there were concerns over just Class 0, that's not necessarily the only provision that one considers when trying to show compliance with the building regulations.
Well, there's the rub, isn't it? I mean, that's the point. When you're looking at external walls, other than the general statement of the need to comply with the functional requirement, what else is there other than Class 0 and after October 2002, Class B?
There is the guidance in the approved document in Section 13.
Which just takes you back to the functional requirement.
No, it says more than that. So it talks about the dangers of using, or the potential dangers of using combustible material in an external wall.
But for a builder and building control to know whether that danger is present, what do they look at in approved document B?
They look at that guidance.
And what in it do they look at?
They look in it that they've been told that combustible material in a cladding system can be a problem for health and safety of occupants in tall buildings.
That's a statement of the obvious, though, isn't it? It's not guidance.
It's statutory guidance. The way I was taught to utilise examples of that in the approved document is that actually think about what you have in hand. And if you feel that actually it might not meet fully, it might not then follow the further guidance given in the approved document about the types of products or the types of situation where combustible insulation is being used, you are still allowed and should revert back, utilising that broad statement, utilising the functional requirement and utilising the performance specification.
Let me try this with you. I am a building owner because it's my responsibility to comply.
Yes.
I've got a Class 0 panel, rain screen panel in my hands with a polyethylene core. I want to put it above 18 metres.
Yes.
Can I?
That will be a discussion for you and your building control authority
Discussion about what?
as to whether it shows compliance with the building regulations, because amounting to putting a product of that nature onto a building is building work, and it would be subject to an application to building control.
And what tells me that I can and what tells me that I can't use my Class 0 panel with a polyethylene core, assuming it genuinely to achieve Class 0? What tells me I can use it and what tells me that I can't?
Prior to 1985, we had a prescriptive book of rules that set out what was acceptable, what was not. There was a decision made to move to a far more innovative, functional approach. In my opinion, there is sufficient guidance in the statutory guidance to say, think about using any combustible material on an external cladding environment of the type to which you refer. And therefore, between the interactions of building owners, the designers and specifiers, and the backstop that is building control, one would expect a discussion to be held that through an application where they're proposing to use a product be it in relation to polyethylene or polyurethane or polyisocyanurate, there would be a consideration as to whether this shows compliance. And if the building owner or the designers felt that, I think that's acceptable, that would then obviously pass through for consideration by building control. And it was my expectation, it was my understanding, them being the experts in building regulations and guidance, that they would interrogate that and question and suggest perhaps that does not show and meet the requirements of the building regulation.
Well, leave aside the expertise of building control. It's for the building owner to satisfy the building regulations, isn't it? The person carrying out the work, yes?
Yes,
Yeah.
agreed.
Not building control. Building control are there to enforce. They're not there to do it, are they?
They're not there. Yes, they are potential. Well, local authorities are able to enforce. But
Now, we've got a Class 0 panel,
Yes.
and I'm the building owner, and I want to know why I can't use it on my high-rise building, even though diagram 40 says I can. What is it in the regulation that tells me I can't use my Class 0 panel?
in the regulation, then typically building control, and when I used to be a district surveyor, you would write back to an applicant informing them that for whatever specific reason, that it does not show compliance with the functional requirement.
Now, I've got a Class 0 panel. What is it that tells me that even though I use it, I'm not going to comply with the functional requirement? In ADB, I've got ADB in one hand, I've got a Class 0 ACM polyethylene panel in the other.
Right.
I see Class 0 in diagram 40. Where else do I look to tell me that even though it's in diagram 40 and tells me I can use it above 80 metres, in fact, I can't with this building? What tells me that?
The statutory guidance that is ADB, if utilised, read and understood, would suggest it could be very much an issue in the section 13 to which I just referred. Then it is a matter of going back to the functional requirement and the performance statement saying, in effect, be careful in terms of using combustible products. But in terms of a binary, yes or no, you can use a product or not, that's not the way in which the approved documents provide guidance.
Right, so tell me, what is it that I, the building owner, have to take into account to decide whether I meet the functional requirement, notwithstanding that I've got a Class 0 panel?
They would have to consider the risk that that panel may place upon it when used in a building of a certain height or a certain situation.
Right. And where are those risks identified that have to be considered by the person carrying out the work?
By virtue of the functional requirements and the performance statements and the guidance therein.
Well, that refers to three things, doesn't it? The height,
Yeah.
the use, and the position of the building.
Yes.
Is that it, or are there more things to add to that list?
No, because obviously at the start of the functional requirement B41 talks about adequate resistance to the spread of fire over the surface of a building.
So, right. So your understanding at the time when considering the potential safety of aluminium composite panels with a PE core is that even though there was Class 0 attached to this panel, the building owner has to go back to the functional requirements and test the safety of that panel against the height, the use, and the position of the building.
In terms of, yes, for their own consideration, but by virtue of, a building owner won't typically themselves go off and come up with a design. They will appoint a professional designer, specifier, so there would be potential for consideration of those issues by an architect or a designer. They too, I would expect, and have been trained if they're qualified and suitably competent on the building regulations and the approved documents. And then whilst you've asked me to forget building control or put them to one side, ultimately this is building work, and therefore an application would go into building control for their consideration. And if, for whatever reason, not just in terms of polyethylene, but if there are other types of combustible insulation being used in a tall building, in the cladding system, but where building control felt that by doing that in the way in which it was incorporated within the installation, that it didn't show and meet the requirements of the building regulations, then they would reject that design.
Does that tell us that whether or not I can use my Class 0 panel on my building depends on, among other things, the people occupying it and their nature, their age, their vulnerabilities, matters of that nature? Was that how you understood it?
Well, by virtue of we look at the potential for risk and similar in relation to certain types of buildings, that would be a consideration. The height is very relevant, certainly for engagement of the brigade in terms of dealing with fires at height and similar. So they are developed over time and understanding, and the guidance offered depending upon ultimately the risk to the people in question.
Mr. Burd, can I just invite your view on this? Isn't one of the difficulties that we have the building regulations couched in very broad terms, as we know? The whole point of ADB is, in effect, to tell people how they can comply with the regulations. And therefore, it may not be very helpful to say that it's not a binary question. You either can or can't. You've got to go beyond that and go back to the regulations. That doesn't seem, from what we've heard, how people actually read them. And for example, we've heard witnesses who are concerned with building control functions tell us that they couldn't ask for more than was required by ADB. Now, that may or may not be right, but it's an illustration of how people actually approach it, isn't it?
It's certainly an illustration of perhaps over time how things might have been changing. It's a fair point to raise, sir, indeed. But competence features heavily in the application of the building regulations, both in terms of the competence of designers and specifiers and building control. I can only speak as, in my experience, when I came in as a trainee district surveyor and then ultimately a regulator, is that the approved documents are not deemed to satisfy. They are guidance for some of the more common situations. And the moment you step away from that, or from the moment that you're coming up with a design which, you know, those competent enough to determine might mean that the functional requirement will not be met, then that is the duty that comes with a functional system. And there might be those that might prefer to go back to a prescriptive book of rules, and there might be those now, in terms of those that believe ADB is in effect, you know, if followed, will show compliance, but that is incorrect. And sorry, sir.
No, sorry, I didn't want to stop you.
No, and so that is something that I suggest, well, it might come up as we move forward with my thoughts as to perhaps where we are now in terms of aspects of the competency of those in the marketplace and what is needed to ensure robust appreciation and use of a regulatory system.
Well, I understand all that, but it seems that one possible view might be that it argues in favour of including in ADB what you might call a child's guide to the preeminence of the regulations, and rather than giving the impression that here it is, you can follow this rule book. Is that a fair view?
That's a fair view, sir. And actually, if we need to support more understanding and appreciation in that way, that could be something that could be considered.
All right. Thank you very much.
No, thank you, sir.
Yes, Mr. Burd.
Can we then go to page 19 of this document? And I'm going to come back to the answer you've just given to the chairman later, I think, in your evidence. But here on the page we have class naught, and it says this: the results from the BAS 476 Part 6 and 7 tests were expected to confirm the class naught performance of the product used in this project. As the results show, all the materials achieved the required performance levels in the fire propagation test, BS 476 Part 6, but a significant number did not achieve the required surface spread of flame classifications. There does not appear to be any one reason for this lack of performance. Now, does that last sentence tell us that there was no singular particular reason that had been identified?
From what's read there in terms of does not appear, I would agree.
Yes. And what was your own reaction, can you recall, to these results when you first learnt of them?
I think we've already touched upon this already, sir, in terms of, yes, it was surprising to be such a number of not meeting the classes. What might the reasons be? And we've already spoken, and I've suggested re-engagement with the procurer of the products. and thereafter potentially what else and other considerations could happen. And not to repeat myself again, but is there items that we could learn from the Radar 2 work that was underway for that contract as well?
Yeah. And did you consider asking the BRE to contact the manufacturers of the 7 products that didn't achieve Class 0?
I can't recall, but in my experience, where we've had things of this nature, there is typically, if there's a relationship with the manufacturer, of course, that can be shared directly. But if not, thereafter, it could be a discussion to be had with local trading standards. But I can't recall if that discussion took place. But that's something that we've done previously.
Do you know whether Trading Standards or perhaps the Advertising Standards Authority had been contacted about this potential?
I'm not aware.
Right. Was this problem raised with ministers at the time? This is September 2002.
I don't believe so, no, sir.
We don't have any evidence, at least any documentary evidence or any witness statement evidence from anybody that those steps were taken, contacting the manufacturer, contacting Trading Standards. Do you know why, if we're right that no such steps were taken, do you know why that is?
No, I don't.
Now, can I then turn to the Class 0 for the aluminium panel product itself? As you'll have seen, I think, and I'll now show you again, one of the 4 products which did achieve Class 0 was the ACM polyethylene cord panel.
Yes.
Yes. And if we go back to page 11, you can see what's said there under the second paragraph there, under the heading rain screen panels. In the first paragraph it says, the aluminium cladding panels achieved a Class 0 performance when tested to BS 476 parts 6 and 7. Both their performance in the fire propagation test and the surface spread of flame test showed that they fully met the requirements of this classification. Now, keeping that in your head, Mr. Burd, if we go down, please, to page 14 in this analysis report, to the last paragraph under the heading rain screen panels there, it says, the aluminium system generated high rates of fire growth and in both cases was extinguished early due to excessive temperatures and fire growth. This is reflected in the indicative classification of DS2 D0. Now, on page 19, you can see in the penultimate paragraph on that page, we have the European reaction to fire and the ISO 9705 tests, and it says this. The aluminium sheeting system, do you see the penultimate paragraph? The aluminium sheeting system achieved the poorest classification in both tests, although it was the only system to achieve Class 0 in the British standard tests. Did those results for ACM surprise or concern you in any way?
Not necessarily, no.
Why is that?
Because they are discretely 2 different tests. And therefore, what it was showing me is that in the national test, it performed in a certain way. In the new, more modern, latest European tests that were coming forward, they performed differently.
Yes, but why did that not concern you? Or is it something you already knew?
I didn't know it definitively, and that was the basis of the Radar 1 and 2 work, that when you test things in a different way, and subject to the nature, in my understanding, the severity of the test you're putting, the size of the flame front, the size of the radiant panel, they could perform very differently.
Did these results not suggest to you in the clearest of terms that there should be, you should have very grave concerns about continuing Class 0 to be used as a standard for fire reaction to fire performance on high-rise buildings?
From my perspective, I recognise that we got, in effect, very different results. You could, in very simple terms, you could say, I would have envisaged that that's because they are different types of test. It didn't necessarily call into question, from my perspective, the reference to Class 0, given to some of the other aspects we've discussed about additional provisions in the approved document of where perhaps you need more than just a Class 0 performance. But again, the radar work was looking very much at the transposition of how products would perform both in the national classification and into the new European classification.
You say it was. In fact, that work had been completed by then.
Yeah.
and the Euro amendments to approved document B were just about to go out. But just looking at it, do you agree that on these results, an ACM panel with a polyethylene core would not have been deemed suitable for use on any building above 18 metres, and if evaluated only based on the Euro classes?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yes, if evaluated only on the Euro class system under the European testing regime, on this result, a polyethylene cored aluminium composite material panel would not have been permitted to be used above 18 metres.
As far as diagram 40 is concerned, correct.
As far as, well, there isn't anything else other than diagram 40, is there?
Well, you're talking about a product, including polyethylene. You don't just use diagram 40. Class O on its own is not the provision for a tall building and in a functional system, and hence there would be other provisions where above that height consideration would be given for things like, yes, the surface spread of flame or the surface would achieve class 0, but you would still revert and look at what was inside the material. Would that amount to a risk for if it were to be utilised and not meet the functional requirements of the building regulation?
Well, that's a slight divergence from the point I'm putting to you. Just looking at the four corners of diagram 40 for the moment, do you accept that you don't pass go if you test these panels under the Euro regime because you only get a D, but you do pass go because you get a class 0 under the national classifications?
No, because if I look at diagram 40 as was written from recollection, as you moved into that document, forgive me, it's quite trying to remember the various iterations, some of which I directly work with and not. There would always be an expectation that you would look at other provisions that might be necessary in the situation you described, sir.
I'm sorry, maybe it's my fault for not asking the question. Looking at the four corners of diagram 40, I am a building owner and I like these panels. I want them on my high-rise building.
Yep.
You now know that if I test it under the Euro regime, I only get a D, and therefore I don't comply with diagram 40. But if I test it under the national classification, I get class 0. So I do comply. Did that dissonance not occur to you at the time when you saw these results?
No.
Why is that?
Because, and again, forgive me, if you just look at diagram 40, I understand it's class 0. That would appear to be, I can meet the need, I can use it for that part of your material consideration. But that's not meeting the building regulations. That's not following the guidance. That's part of diagram 40 in a guidance document that shows you some of the ways of showing compliance. But we'll take a building owner who hasn't got that competence necessary in depth of understanding. Yes, they could have looked at approved document B, diagram 40, and gone, yeah, I can use it if I've got class 0, but I can't if I've tested to the European. That I understand, sir, and I agree with you. But what I'm saying, as a former user of the approved documents and then a regulator, your consideration is broader than that.
I understand that. But the point I'm putting to you is that under the Euro regime, you don't get to first base. Under the national regime, you do get to first base. All you're saying is that there's a second base as well.
I agree, sir.
Right. But as a result of that, though, did you not have cause to consider whether class 0 was an appropriate and safe metric measurement system for external surfaces of high-rise buildings, given the actual performance of this product in this test?
Sorry, sir, could you ask the question again?
Yes. Did these results not cause you to go back, in a sense, to the harmonisation work that had been done and to which we will return, and re-examine it and ask yourself, well, really, why do we need class 0? It's not an equivalent to class B, and it provides an easier way of satisfying the linear requirements than if we were to insist on the European regime. Did these tests not fix in your mind the need to revisit that question?
I can't recall if I had that thought, but as you quite correctly state, the radar work had finished, and what we'd seen, that the new European tests coming online, albeit an awful lot of manufacturers hadn't used them, were a more demanding test, and therefore, in time, yes, the national class could fall, and the new European test methods could be a more befitting test method going forward.
Right. We're going to come back to those timeframes later on. Can we look at the conclusions and recommendations from the testing programme? And if we stick with this document and go on, please, to page 24, we can see those set out here. This is the analysis report of the 19th of September 2002. Now, it's headed Conclusion and Recommendations. If you just cast your eye down the 7 paragraphs that comprise that section, you can see, I think, and agree with me, that there are no actual recommendations in this section.
I agree.
Yes. Now, if we look at paragraphs 1, 2, and 3 of the conclusions, it says this: the results from the British Standard tests show that although purchased as Class 0 products, only 4 of the 11 products tested satisfied Class 0 requirements. 2, the aluminium sheet product satisfied Class 0 requirements, but in the full-scale test, intermediate scale and single burning item test proved to be one of the worst performing products. 3, correlation between the Euroclass and ISO 9705 data based on figure calculations proved to be acceptable for the range screen and render systems. However, no acceptable correlation was found for the composite panel systems. Now, going back if we can, I've shown you that. There's a question coming, but we need first to look at the closing report of 3 days before. BRE 30 is 41895, please, and the recommendations and conclusions there, page 13. And what we see there is, and there are recommendations here, if we go please to page 13, you can see in paragraph 5, at the foot of the page, the aluminium sheet product satisfied Class 0 requirements, but in the full-scale, intermediate scale and single burning item test proved to be one of the worst performing products. And then it says this: as the current guidance in approved document B asks for Class 0 performance in diagram 40, these issues may require further consideration. Now, may require further consideration. Now, the background to this is that the ACMPE panel had resulted in a catastrophic full-scale failure before 6 minutes. How did you understand these words? These issues may require further consideration.
20-some years ago, I cannot recall. I acknowledge, and with the benefit of hindsight looking at this here, it's not a particularly strong recommendation, and perhaps doesn't capture, as you described, the nature of the fire that we saw. But even so, it is a recommendation, albeit predicated with the use of the word may. I believe, I think it would have, again, going forward, it would have been something that would be considered in a future full review of the approved document B. But it doesn't quite capture, it's not a particularly strong recommendation, but it would have been considered in the next recollection, the next review of the approved document for a fuller review of the technical guidance.
Which wasn't due for another 3 years?
Wasn't due for another 3 years, but typically, from recollection, looking at the work that certainly BRE were undertaking, it started in 2004. But I didn't take that so I took it that this is something that could be considered as part of that. It wasn't exactly saying something needs to be done now.
We can agree on the wording, but is that how you took it at the time? Not an urgent red flag, something to be pondered in the fullness of time?
Yes.
Who in your department was supposed to interpret and understand the data, the science that you were given by the BRE?
Typically, as the lead desk officer, I would receive these reports.
So was that you?
It would be me,
Right.
sir. I can't recall if the number 2 on fire safety, Darren Hobbs, had arrived by that time. And so that would have been, Darren would have looked at these as well. We might have discussed them with other regulators. We had fairly regular meetings with the other regulators around the UK. I'm not saying that this was something that was sort of considered here, but inside the department, it would have been myself and my deputy.
And looking at the data, as well as this recommendation, notwithstanding its terms, were you left in any doubt at all at this time that the use of aluminium rain screen panels with a polyethylene core, when used at height, presented a serious risk to life?
I'm truly trying to recall what I considered at the time. But from recollection, would have considered and discussed it with the IAG and similar, and felt that whilst they performed poorly, and a number of them did, that the provisions, and I'm sorry to keep repeating, that the provisions that is the building regulations and the guidance therein would provide the protection that was necessary, because they wouldn't show compliance. And I envisage I would have thought about it was quite timely and correct that the learnings from this would feed in to set the ultimate pass-fail criteria for these sorts of products.
Now, I know you've repeated that answer a number of times,
Yes,
and I'm
sir.
not being critical of you at all, but I want to be absolutely clear. Do we take it that at this time, and perhaps from this time, notwithstanding your knowledge of the performance of ACM with the PE core in full-scale tests, in contradistinction to the small-scale tests which permitted it to have Class B, Class 0, you thought that ADB essentially prevented their use above 18 metres because of the general words in 13.7?
Because of the guidance and the provisions therein, yes. And again, because it is so long ago, and with the IAG, I'm sure there have been discussions with the representatives from building control, the other regulators. I felt confident, that actually it was suitably controlled.
Because of those general words?
Well, because of those words. I mean, it is statutory guidance.
Yes. Okay. I just want to be clear about the words.
Yeah.
It's the words in 13.7 that we looked at on Thursday.
It's the words in 13.7 and the functional requirement and the performance statement.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, just drawing the threads together, do you accept that this project demonstrated through these two reports to you, latest September 2002, and I'm going to put four things to you. First, that the national reaction to fire classification system in general and the Class 0 classification in particular was not able to detect the fire hazard associated with the use of some, possibly common, combustible rain screen cladding products?
I agree with that, sir, on the basis of only using that national classification to assess the product.
Yes.
Yes.
Do you agree that from this time, latest September 2002, government was aware that although such a product could achieve a Class 0 reaction to fire classification, according to the national classification system, nonetheless it presented a clear external fire spread hazard?
Again, yes, if only utilised on its own, the national classification methodology.
Same question again, and by all means add the qualification that a PE cored aluminium rain screen cladding product was likely to perform dangerously with respect to external fire spread hazards.
Considering the that we saw, which was one test, then therefore there was evidence, as we saw, that this could be an issue if only utilised in relation to Class 0 and not in relation to the other provisions and in relation to the statutory guidance, and again the circling back to the functional requirement and performance statement.
And finally, that fire safety compliance testing was either flawed or because it wasn't reproducible, or there were technical loopholes which were being exploited by manufacturers, or else they were making false claims about their products.
In terms of, if you're referring to the data about Class 0 and the examples that were perceived to be claiming Class 0 and then didn't achieve it, of course that was raised, and so that's something that we would have, again, considered as part of, or maybe we did as part of the radar work. Could you break your question down thereafter?
Yes, of course, absolutely. There are three parts to it.
Yep.
There are three alternatives I'm putting to you as known by government as of the autumn of 2002. The first is that fire safety compliance testing was flawed because of reproducibility problems.
I couldn't say I knew that, but from what was tested here with, as you've rightfully suggested, which was a small amount of products for this, I couldn't say I agree that we thought it was flawed.
The alternative is that there were technical loopholes being exploited by manufacturers to achieve Class 0. Did you consider that?
Can I ask what you mean by technical loophole?
Yes, testing the foil on the surface of the product without exposing the whole thing to a Class 0 test.
That's been known
Yes.
for some time, that subject to the thickness of the outer skin of a composite product, it could achieve Class 0. And again, hence the reason to revert back to the guidance and appreciate what might be under that in the terms of combustible material.
And then the third is manufacturers making false claims about fire safety.
I wouldn't say it was commonplace that I was aware of that. We spoke earlier in my evidence about what was going on between the plastics-based fraternity and the mineral fibre in terms of whether they were making known claims about performance. I wouldn't have been aware of if they were doing it fraudulently or not.
Now, Mr. Burd, these two reports and the data from this project have never, before this inquiry began to investigate, been released into the public domain, have they?
No, they have not.
Do you know why that is?
I can only envisage that it is, in effect, fallen between BRE and the department. It's typically government policy with public money that these should be published, and looking at it, and with the benefit of hindsight, a natural point to even release the generic data for the full-scale testing would have been when we published BR 135.
In the following year?
In the summer 2003. Yeah. And by the same token, in terms of another opportunity could ultimately have been when citation of BR 135 and 8414 were proposed in 2005 consultation document for ADB. And so that would have been another opportunity. And so from my perspective, I didn't realise that they hadn't been published, but I agree they should have been published. And for me, it's something that's in effect fallen down between the department and BRE.
How? How could it have fallen down between those two? This is government data.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. If you look at the amount of testing and research we undertake in relation to approved document B, it's considerable. And therefore, by virtue of then trying to draw it together, which we did in 2005 for the consultation, it should have formed part of that suite of research that was published by ourselves, by BRE and other research providers.
Were the BRE themselves free to publish this without the consent of government?
Typically they wouldn't do that. They would have asked if they could have published it.
Do you know whether that question was raised with you or anybody else in the department?
I don't believe it was, sir.
Now, if it was, as I think you say, typical because it was funded by public money, that these reports would be published, can you ascribe a reason for why that typical policy or route wasn't taken?
I can't. I can only presume it formed part of a huge amount of research that ultimately fed into the 2006 approved document B.
Did you yourself give any consideration to putting these two reports, which are quite lengthy and quite striking, out into the public domain so that industry could know of them?
I can't recall, but if I had, they would have been there. As I say, when we published the approved document B consultation in 2005, and it's still there, there's a web page on the BRE website which lists all of the research that fed into the ADB review, both BREs and governments in terms of the Building Disaster Assessment Group work and what was originally the forward and backward look that we undertook as part of that first step to reviewing Part B. Quite simply, it should have been there.
Yes. Was a decision taken not to publish this data?
I don't believe so, no.
Now, we know that in and after 2013, there were, I think after 2012, in fact, there were fires in the Middle East, in the UAE, involving aluminium composite material with a polyethylene core. And there were also fires in Dubai in 2014 and 2015, and the La Crosse fire in Melbourne in 2014 as well. Even after that, can you explain why this data was not put into the public domain?
No, I cannot. But from my perspective, well, you've not asked that. We'll come on to that, I'm sure. There were revisions made to the approved document in 2006, coming into force 2007, that would have further guided on such things. But given those fires, no, I can't recall why then this wasn't then published.
Can you explain why this data wasn't published after the Grenfell Tower fire itself in June 2017?
With all due respect, so I left in 2013, so I wouldn't have the answer for that.
Yes. Well, given it's unusual, given the fact that not publishing it was unusual, was there a cover-up?
No, there was not, sir.
How do you know?
But from my perspective, sat here today, there was no cover-up from my perspective.
Right. See, some people looking at this, the importance of the results, your evidence today, might think that the government had deliberately covered up the test results showing that ACM panels with a Class 0 badge performing disastrously at height was covered up, and the government let them be used at height for another 17 years. What would you say to them?
I can see how that might appear and why people might think that. I can only provide you with my assurance that that is not what happened from my perspective.
And they might also put to you the fact that the reason why there was a cover-up was because of the fear of what industry might do.
Again, I can see why people might think that, but from my perspective, there was no such cover-up.
Or that the government might know that releasing these results would immediately trigger a cladding crisis.
From my perspective, and we didn't really explore it too heavily, but this work, albeit in generic form, did indeed go out back to the IAG and to the BSI Joint Committee looking at developing the 8414 test, parts 1 and then part 2. So some of the generic data did indeed go out, sir. So that's just a point I would add.
What?
And ultimately, a pass-fail criteria was set, which would ensure that if these types of systems were tested, they would have failed.
Yes. Can we then turn to harmonisation, a topic we've covered a little bit earlier this morning? Yes. RADAR, I think, stands for Research on Approved Document B and Revision, doesn't it?
It does.
I'm going to summarise. I think it's right that, correct me if I'm wrong here, as a result of the European Construction Products Directive, the department had to consider amendments and updates to approved document B.
Yes.
Yes. And they had to do that in order to allow for the presence of the European fire test methods.
That's correct. What we had to remove were technical barriers to trade.
Technical barriers to trade. And the radar research was initiated to help the department understand how these new European standards and classification systems should be implemented into the UK regulatory environment.
Yes, sir.
Yes. And also to explore the impact of doing so on industry.
To a degree, yes, from
Yes.
recollection, yes.
Now, again, this is material I'm expecting you to say yes to, but just so we're clear about your own understanding. Radar was research commissioned by the department and carried out by Warrington Fire.
Yes.
And there were 3 parts: Radar 1, fire resistance; Radar 2, reaction to fire; and Radar 3, roofing and testing relating to roofing products.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, is it right that the focus of the research was on comparing the classifications achieved by various products when tested under the Euroclass system against the classifications achieved by the very same product when tested under the relevant parts of the British standards to achieve particular classifications under the existing national class
Yes,
system?
sir.
Yes. Now, I think it's right also that there are 2 reports from Radar 2 in May 2000. Let me just put both of those up on the screen. The first is CLG 50950. And if we turn to page 2 in that, please, you'll see that it has the date of the 23rd of May at the very bottom right-hand corner.
Yes.
And this is part 1, UK and European test data and comparisons between classification systems. And the second one, there's a part 2, which is at CLG 50951. If we can go to that, please. And that has page 1 there, and the date there is 26th of May 2000.
Yes.
And it's called Part 2, Proposals for the European Supplement to Approved Document B.
Yes.
Now, my first question for you is, were you familiar with these documents at the time, in May 2000?
I would have been, yes.
Right. Now, the radar project was a PII, Partners in Innovation project, wasn't
Yes,
it?
it was.
That meant that 50% of the funding came from the department and 50% from industry.
Yes.
Yes. Do you know which industry partners contributed to the funding of the Radar 2 project?
I can't recall, but typically there was a large suite of testing undertaken. So when we talk about contributing to the cost, it would have been from a number of parties, manufacturers, bringing their products forward at their cost, ultimately to be tested and assessed. So it would have been quite a sizable number. But this was, again, because this was all about undertaking testing to inform how we might best give visible recognition to the new European method of test, it was taken on in this way. And of course, it was a huge amount of testing as well. And so for it to be undertaken with industry, a sharing of the financial burden was suitably important.
Now, you've said in the last answer that the contribution would have been for a number of parties, manufacturers, bringing their products forward at their cost, ultimately to be tested.
Yes.
Now, I think 64 products were tested.
Okay.
And were they all put forward by manufacturers?
I don't know. I would envisage it would have been a discussion between Warrington and the manufacturers as to what should come forward, because Warrington, having expertise in research, would have wanted the relevant sort of thematics and types of products to help them best inform, ultimately, again, another industry advisory group, that we can take comfort in the degree of testing undertaken and the amount of products undertaken for certain types of product, be it a lining material or similar.
Right. Now, go to page 4, please, in this, table 2. Here we see the transposition of UK Class 0 to Euro classes, you see?
Yes.
And at the bottom of the table there is a range of results that we can see for some 35 products.
Yes.
We counted them, which achieve national class 0 and tested under the Euro norms and achieve results in a range A1 through to E. Yes?
Yes.
Yes. Now, that includes a number of products, 4 in all, as you can see at the foot of the table,
Yes.
which tested below Euro Class B. They got a C,
Yep.
2 got a D, and 1 got an E.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Did you consider that the data in that table was representative of the range of products actually available on the market at the time?
Again, this would have been a consideration within the industry advisory group, and that's something that Warrington would have thought through in detail to make sure that they had suitable representation and products to test.
Right. Really, what I'm asking is what you thought. I mean, did you assume at the time that these products were representative of what was actually available on the market in common use, or did you interrogate it and ask the question?
I can't recall if I interrogated it, but I'd be very surprised if it wasn't representative of the marketplace, because that would have amounted to quite a material consideration for the work at hand.
Now, let's look at the minutes of the BRAC meeting on the 10th of May 2001, the following year. And we're going to flip between these two reports, I'm afraid. This is at CLG 407308. I'll show you the first page of that document.
Of course.
You can see that it's a minute of the minutes of the Part B Working Party meeting, 10th of May 2001 in Eland House, or is it Elland House or Eland?
Eland.
Eland, okay. And on the right-hand column, you can see that under Debbie Smith's name appears your name, Anthony Burd, yes?
Yes.
Right. Now, if we then go, please, to page 7, under paragraph 5.7, under the heading Radar 2 Reaction to Fire, you can see that it records Dr. Smith explaining that there's a problem. And she says in the second line, Dr. Smith explained that one problem was that there was an uneven distribution of products submitted for testing. Since PII is 50% industry-led, industry sent in the products that it wanted to send in. There is a natural reluctance by industry to put in poor-performing products. Now, just looking at that, doesn't that suggest, or did that suggest to you at the time, that the data set in Table 2 that we've been looking at, the 35 products in the transposition point, it was unrepresentative, or might be unrepresentative, of the market?
Dr. Smith raised that as a potential point, but I wouldn't necessarily say it called into question the robustness of what had been undertaken and tested.
Why would it not?
Because we would have looked at it from the perspective of what products to make sure that we had sufficient focus from recollection in relation to the breakdown of what would have amounted to comparing products to class 0, 1, 2 and 3. So an observation from Debbie Smith, but again, I should imagine this is a report, this is the minutes of the meeting, there would have been discussion.
Yes. I mean, given the way in which these products came to Warrington, namely by selection by the industry who made them, does it follow from that it was at least possible that although Table 2 records the majority of Class 0 products tested as having achieved Class B or better, in reality, many products not submitted for testing but available on the market, and perhaps in common use, might not have been able to achieve a Class B rating under the Euroclass system?
They might not have been able to achieve it, yes.
What work had been done in order to identify how commonly used the Class 0 products at the bottom of the table, which had achieved C, D and E, were in the UK?
I don't know what considerations were given at that time. As you probably saw from the front cover of the Warrington report you showed me, Tony Edwards was still principal fire safety professional. And whilst I attended some of the radar work, not all of it, that discussion I envisage would have taken place. The other thing to say, of course, if I may, is that if you don't want to bring forward a poorer performing product, that's for you to consider. But ultimately, when there comes a time for something that needs testing, you will have to test that product. So I understand that you'll say, but we weren't at this point making the European test methodology, as far as you can make such a thing, in the approved document be the only way to follow. But if people didn't naturally bring products forward because they're fearful they might not perform, ultimately that would come out in the marketplace. In fact, that would have come out in the marketplace when the department, the government, made CE marking mandatory, which required you to produce performance classifications based on the European test methodology.
If it did.
No, it did. It did in 2013.
2013.
Yes, sir.
Yes, that's right. 12 years later.
Yes.
Yes. But coming back to my question, I think the question is none, but just to ask it again, had any work been done to identify how commonly used, what the frequency of use was of the Class 0 products tested, which had achieved classes C, D and E?
Not that I can recall.
So for all you knew, product ref 103, which achieved an E, could have been a market leader above 18 metres.
Potentially.
But because it achieved Class 0, it could continue to be used.
The primary intent of the European supplement was to give visible recognition to the new European test methodologies that were coming forward under the auspices of the Construction Products Directive.
Yes, and the methodology selected for transposition was one of, I think the phrase he used here is product density, not in the physical sense, but cluster. Statistically, density of cluster points around the transposition point. Yes?
Yes.
And we can see that from figure 1 if we look later on in this document. But given that that is the way it was done, why was no examination undertaken of whether or not those products which had fallen outside the range at the top of the bell curve, as it were, were nonetheless so frequently used that it would be dangerous to allow this method to continue?
I don't quite necessarily understand why it would be dangerous to allow it to continue, because if we are suggesting that those that coming forward with a product didn't want what they perceived to be a poorer product being tested, you would therefore only have the national classification, which I acknowledge, sir. But if it was to be used in an environment whereby it could form a risk because it included an element of combustibility, then there were other provisions in the approved documents and the regulations that would have addressed those.
And is that what you referred to before? That's back to the functional requirements
Yes.
and the performance requirements. What consideration was given to the possibility, in relation to the eventual decision to transpose Class 0 as Euro Class B, to the possibility that those products which had achieved Class 0 but nonetheless achieved classes C, D and E were frequently used in the UK market?
Again, the whole purpose of the Construction Products Directive was to allow a harmonisation of test methodologies. UK government at that point had not made CE marking mandatory under the CPR, but what we couldn't do is be a barrier to trade. And therefore, it was imperative that we moved forward to offer a transposition between national and European classes that could be utilised. So we didn't preclude the use of products coming in, but there was still a choice as to what methodology you might decide to pick going forward, as far as the guidance in the approved document was concerned.
Did anybody examine whether the kinds of Class 0 products which failed to meet Class B or better were used in particular places? I mean, were they cladding products? Were they insulation products? Were they internal wallpaper or lining products?
There would have been consideration of the broad type of product. It would have been generically captured as to what it was used. But again, I mean, the thing with what we have here is that we have two, whilst they're used for the purposes of measuring fire spread in terms of lining materials, they are subtly different tests, and therefore there was an expectation that being, and let's be quite clear, a more modern, more demanding test, there would be winners and losers depending upon the type of product at hand.
Did you question the methodology of using this bell curve type of approach to transposition without knowing the frequency of use or the intended use of these 4 Class 0 products which had not achieve Class B?
We would have had discussions about this sort of approach, but what we were trying to find was a best fit in terms of a transposition between national and European.
Now, I think at the time, you and the Part B Working Party were considering the Radar 2 reports in the context of Approved Document B 2000,
Yes.
the 1991 building regulations, but with ADB 2000, yes?
From recollection, yes, sir.
Yeah, and that only contained one suggested restriction for the use of cladding panels on the external face of buildings over 18 metres, namely Class 0 within diagram 40.
Sorry, could you ask the question again, please, sir?
Yes, there was only one restriction, or was only one item of guidance, if I can use a more neutral expression, namely not Class 0.
In terms of?
In terms of what the linear route to compliance was. Class 0.
For cladding systems?
Yes.
In addition to the provisions we've spoken about?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, were you aware at the time, so this is May 2001, that the fire at Knowsley Heights 10 years before, in 1991, had spread up the external face of the building in its entirety, despite the fact that the cladding panels used had achieved Class 0?
As I explained on my evidence on Thursday, I became aware of Knowsley Heights as part of the preparations for the Select Committee. From what we were doing here with the European supplement was removing technical barriers to trade. It wasn't in effect a full technical review of the approved document B. What we needed to do was to provide transposition between national and European tests. But from our perspective, knowing what we learnt from the radar work, that we found that the European test was typically a more demanding test, and therefore we had to make sure that the comparisons of what Class 0 equated to was suitably positioned. And so we didn't want the European class being brought forward in a way that lowered levels of safety. But other than that, this was not a full technical review of the approved document B.
No, I understand that, but given your reference to the Select Committee, given you knew by this point, I think, May 2001, and had known for a year, that the Select Committee's recommendation was to substitute Class 0 with a full-scale test, yes?
Yes.
Against that background, and against also the background of the fact that some Class 0 products of unknown frequency in use got Class 0 but not Class B, but did worse, against that background, did the results in the radar report not prompt you to consider whether the department should now move to implement the recommendations of the Select Committee?
For recollection, this document would have gone out in, I forget which year it went out for public consultation, sir, but we only had access to BRE 135 and the pass-fail criteria in the summer of 2003. BS 8414 Part 1 was published at the end of 2002, so there would have been no possibility of including that package of the full-scale testing option within this document.
Then why not advise the government, or why not advise your seniors and take the decision that in the light of the work done by this harmonisation group, in the light of the fact that there were a number of products that failed to achieve Class B, even though they achieved Class 0, and in the light of the Select Committee's original recommendation, to move straight to getting rid of Class 0 as soon as the full-scale test was adopted as the British standard at the end of 2002?
So, well, there's a number of components there, sir. From the European supplement perspective, it was to remove technical barriers to trade. It was to bring about, in effect, no market distortion, and therefore it was all about how best to accommodate the European test methodology and the classifications there too, and how it compared to the national classifications. From this point, there may have been considerations that ADB would then be subject to a full technical review, starting, it would have been late 2013, 2014. So that would have been a material consideration there. The other point to say is that without a full-scale test methodology with pass-fail criteria, and I've given, that was end of 2012 and 2013, we couldn't immediately mobilise, in my opinion, into requiring, well, as much as you can require in statutory guidance, only using the European test methodology, because it had only just arrived. And as we were seeing here, Radar was the first foray where we were having manufacturers come forward and test their products to the new European methodology. And so that would have brought about market distortion and wouldn't have met the agreed backdrop that this was to amount to a transposition which would bring about removing technical barriers to trade.
Is that a convenient moment?
Yes, I think it is. We'll stop there now so we can all have some lunch. Mr. Burd, we'll resume, please, at 2:05. And again, please don't talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room.
Thank you, sir.
All right, thank you very much. 2:05, please.